Welcome to the Academic Writing Amplified podcast. On this podcast, we believe that the culture of academia needs to change radically. Women and non-binary people are revolutionizing academia within institutions that were not built for us. If you're ready to reject the culture of overwork, kick guilt and overwhelm to the curb, and amplify your voice to make a real impact on your field without breaking down or burning out, you're in the right place. With our team of experienced writing coaches as co-hosts, we'll share insights and talk to inspiring guests to bring you the practical strategies, systems, and mindset shifts you need to find time to write, publish work you love, and design your career on your terms. And it all starts with writing. Let's go. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Academic Writing Amplified. I'm Kathy Mazak, founder of this podcast and Scholar's Voice, the professional development company that helps academic women and non-binary professors write and publish to the level in line with their expertise. I'm so excited to let you know that our Navigate program is now open for enrollment. Yes, that means that we are accepting applications. So all you have to do is go to scholarsvoice.org/navigate, where you will find all the program information, including program pricing, all the modules, how the calls work, call date and time. And you will see that our applications are open. So when you look at that pink button at the top of the page, it should say apply now. Now, our applications are only open until April 19th. And our application process is a 3-step process. First, a really quick application that you can fill out on your phone. So if you're listening to this podcast on an app on your phone and you're not driving, then right now you can go to scholarsvoice.org/navigate, find that pink button. You can fill this little application out even as you're taking your walk. And once that application is accepted, then you will get a link to take our Navigate benchmark assessment, which is our tool that we use to measure your progress throughout this process of developing your writing and publishing. We do it at the beginning and at the end of our 12-week program. And every time you take Navigate, we repeat it so that you can see your progress throughout your journey towards mastery of the key concepts that we teach and develop inside of Navigate. Once you've done the benchmark assessment, which really doesn't take that long, it's about 20 multiple choice questions. It's totally straightforward. Then you will also get the link to schedule a quick 30-minute pre-enrollment call with me. So that means that you get to talk directly to me, get all your questions answered about the program. I go through a process during that pre-enrollment call where we are both figuring out whether Navigate is the right next step for you. And if we both decide that it is, then I'll invite you to enroll right on the call. So go to scholarsvoice.org/navigate and apply for Navigate today. Hello, friends, and welcome back to the Academic Writing Amplified podcast. I have a juicy episode for you today. It's one that if you're in any of my programs or if I coach you, you will know that this has been coming and has been brewing for a while. And on this episode, I'm going to do my book review of Cal Newport's latest work, which is called Slow Productivity: The Lost Art of Accomplishment Without Burnout. If you've been a longtime listener of our podcast, then you know that I often recommend Cal Newport's book called Deep Work as one of, I think, the important books that one should read as an academic trying to get work done. And this one is not that. But I will also just mention a couple of other books by Cal Newport in case you want to check them out. One that many of my clients have read and that I have on my shelf, but I have to admit that I haven't picked it up, is A World Without Email. So that's one, if you're especially struggling with the kind of email overload, that's one to check out. I either have digital, I can't remember if I read Digital Minimalism on Paper or not, or whether I listened to it. But anyway, that's another book he has that I would say you can skip that one. The idea is cut things from your digital life, add them back as they are necessary. Now you don't have to read the book. But I would say Deep Work and A World Without Email are probably both, really worth picking up. And I think that you'll be able to decide for yourself whether slow productivity is on your list of Cal Newport reads, hopefully by the end of this podcast. So let me start with saying, before I go any further, just because this is of the timeliness of this episode coming out, we are right now in our enrollment period for our Navigate program for the summer session or the summer cohort of Navigate. If you're listening at another time, you can still go to scholarsvoice.org/navigate and find the pink button and get on the wait list. But if you're listening in real time or, within a week or so, or a couple weeks of when this episode comes out, we're open for enrollment, which means we're accepting applications. Throughout this little book review, I will be mentioning my Navigate program because there's so much in slow productivity that aligns with what we teach in Navigate. So I will leave it at that. And let's get to the book review. All right. So slow productivity, again, the subtitle is The Lost Art of Accomplishment Without Burnout. Cal Newport is, I think, an interesting author in the productivity space for us as academics because he is also an academic. So he is an author. He has been writing books since he was 20-something years old. He started with productivity books for college and high school students. And he's just been writing productivity books since he was in his 20s. Now I believe he's around in his 40s. He is a professor at Georgetown in computer science. And I think he got his PhD at MIT. The more it seems that he moves through his career, according to what he has said in podcast interviews that I've heard him on and on his own podcast, he has been doing more and more kind of work in theories of technology and that kind of stuff as a computer scientist. And so it is kind of like my understanding is that his academic work is like the more theoretical side of our relationship with technology. And his books are kind of for mass media, like books, they're for a wide audience. This book is specifically for knowledge workers, and he includes academics inside of knowledge workers, obviously, I guess. And he has a lot of examples in the book that talk about academics or people with academic positions, professors. And also, though, he includes anybody who does any kind of knowledge work. So computer programmers would be in there, content creators, people who work at software companies, people who work at other companies, just like anybody who does work that isn't manual labor, factory work, that kind of thing. He's very much interested in, it's a line throughout his work, throughout his mass media publications, he's writing them for what he calls knowledge workers. And we're included in that. So yay. Well, let me start with a little summary. So first, I want to say, I always like to mention, I love the feel of this book in your hand. It's a little paperback. It's not as big, like Deep Work was hefty, and this is smaller. It is 200 and some pages. So let's see, without notes, it's like 220 pages or so. Really easy to read. I just love the format of the book. And I always since I'm a book lover, I just want to appreciate the fact that the size they chose for this book is really nice. And that this is not a book that is going to take you that long to read. It's read it in a weekend. I think it took me probably a weekend plus the rest of the week, where I don't read quite as much as I do on weekends to finish it. It wasn't hard to read. And also the organization of the book is very simple. So it starts with a chapter called The Rise and Fall of Pseudo Productivity, where he kind of explains this idea of how knowledge workers took on, since knowledge work is relatively new, the last 50 years or so, and it's kind of invisible. So you can't, this is a major part of this book. This is what it all kind of, the crux of the book is. Since knowledge work is not factory work, it is not agriculture, it is not something where we can measure like in agriculture. Well, there you go. Our dairy, for example, we can say that every 2 days, every milking, the cows produce this much milk. And there's all of these different factors that lead into that. But basically, the number that we track in our dairy is milk per cow per day. So what that number, we track that because that goes down, then we know something's wrong. And what we're always trying to do is get that up to a certain amount. Obviously, it can't go up forever. But that's a measurable outcome, right? Liters of milk, bushels of grain, that kind of thing. Ford Model Ts that come off the assembly line in a certain amount of time. So in non-knowledge work, in some kinds of non-knowledge work, service work, I think is a part as well. But in work that's like factory work or agriculture, there's these like very measurable, tangible outcomes and products. And the human's job in those systems is if you're putting together the Model T, this person puts in the clutch or this person puts on the roof, and how many you do a day is like countable. And the work of being on a factory line, you can see it, right? It looks like I pick up this thing and I put it over here, or I press these buttons and then I make sure this is aligned and then I screw it together. It's like very, very tangible, but knowledge work is not. So as a knowledge worker, it's hard to see the work. The outputs of the work are variable. So it's just not quite as measurable and tangible and seeable as other kinds of work. And so what Cal Newport says is that what we have come to do is measure knowledge work with like pseudo productivity. So we need some kind of proxy for real productivity, like bushels of grain produced per acre. In knowledge work, you need some kind of proxy for that. And we've been using other kinds of things as the proxy. So hours that we sit in front of the computer or hours that we clock in and clock out in the office as a proxy for productivity. Or number of emails that we sent, how fast we respond to the emails, how many meetings we have, right? This constant banter around the work. He calls it like pseudo productivity, that the work around the work is a proxy for actually measurable product outcomes of work. So what this has caused is that like, oh, if you want to look like you're working, then you need to be answering your emails as fast as possible, or you need to be putting a certain number of hours in. People need to see you sitting at your desk, which I'll just have to say, oh my God, I remember that from my very first job. And what made me want to become an academic, although maybe this backfired, but what made me want to become an academic was that I worked at a software company in Ann Arbor, Michigan in 1990, 94, 95, around there. I worked at a software company and I was the technical writer. And then I also did some marketing writing, and I actually built their website with a book with HTML. Like I got a book from the bookstore on HTML. It's this giant fat blue book. And I coded the first version of their website. It was 1995, I think. Anyway, I just remember when I would talk to my manager, he would be like, well, the way that you're going to get promoted or the way that you're going to move up in this company is that you have to get here before me and you have to leave after me. And that was so counter to the way that I work because, as you all know, if you've been listening to this podcast for a long time, I have my soaring state and then I have these lulls, and I would have to like continue to sit at my cubicle during the lulls. That was what made me say, nope, I'm going back to school for my master's degree. That conversation that I had with that manager, because what he wanted to see was this stand-in for productivity. Like that was the way he was measuring, not the quality of the work or even the speed of the work. It was are you here before me and do you leave after me? It's like, how many hours are you sitting at your desk? It's a proxy. This is like a really good point that Cal Newport makes here is this is a proxy for the real measurement of the work. Okay, so big idea here is we've been measuring productivity all wrong. We're looking at pseudo productivity. It looks this certain way. It looks like fast response to email. It looks like Slack messages back and forth, like that kind of thing. It looks like sitting in the chair in the office, showing up. And of course, the pandemic kind of put a big, like exacerbated that. And he gets into details like about how the pandemic changed knowledge work because it just made all of these things kind of explode and people were like, I'm done. Now, that's the kind of the introduction to the book. Then he talks about a slower alternative, his next chapter, and he proposes based on the slow foods movement. He talks about the history of slow food movement and takes this concept of slow foods to this idea of slow price. So he gets the slow from slow food movement, and he has come up with this definition of slow productivity, which I'll read you now. It's on page 8 of the book. Slow productivity is a philosophy for organizing knowledge work efforts in a sustainable and meaningful manner based on the following 3 principles. 1, do fewer things. 2, work at a natural pace. And 3, obsess over quality. So then he goes on to spend long chapters. He calls them himself like the long chapters on one on do fewer things, the second one on work at a natural pace, and the third one on obsess over quality. And then he has a conclusion. That's the whole book. But as he's digging through or explaining those principles, he's kind of going back in time to like pre-computer technology people who were very productive, who were knowledge workers. So he talks about Jane Austen. He talks about Jewel, the singer Jewel. So I guess she's not pre-computers, but like he talks about different types of artists and writers and theoreticians and things like that, knowledge workers. Like, what did they do that embodied these principles and that those principles kind of gave them or helped them to be very successful? So again, do fewer things, work at a natural pace, and obsess over quality. His examples are all from poets and artists and people who, I think he talks about Marie Curie at some point, like the different people throughout time. And he did research on what their process was, and uses them as examples for these principles. And then he tries to, and I emphasize the try, he tries to make these, like give you concrete ways to enact these principles in your work if you are a knowledge worker. So that is the book. And I'll start with let me say this. I just want to start with a plug for The Slow Professor. I talk about that book all the time on this podcast. Go read that book. If you have to choose between slow productivity and The Slow Professor, go read The Slow Professor. So I also just want to say that's the use of the word slow. Cal Newport really thinks he's something for like applying this to knowledge work, but The Slow Professor did it before this. So go read that book first. So getting into what I like about slow productivity. So I really like the first 2 principles: do fewer things and work at a natural pace. I think that if you're a longtime listener of this podcast, you have heard me say do fewer things in many different ways. And this is something that I teach inside of Navigate on how to do fewer things. So when your friends or your people on the internet and the world says, oh, you're so busy, you need to learn how to say no, that is doing fewer things, right? When I say you need to curate your pipeline, so that means you need to cull away and not just publish anything, but really select the projects that are on mission enough to make it all the way through your publication pipeline. That is also doing fewer things. In our Navigate program, we teach systems that help support you in doing fewer things and help you develop the discernment that you need in order to say like, yes, this, no, that. which I think is much more helpful than just saying no, but rather developing discernment about what is going to occupy your one wonderful life and your very precious time, right? So I really like do fewer things. I also like work at a natural pace. In that chapter, he really talks about seasonality. And this is something, again, I talk about all the time. I think I recently did a podcast episode here about it. And it's something that is part of that in our Navigate program. It's a part of a lot of the program. We talk about creating seasonality year over year. We talk about it creating seasonality throughout the semester. And we talk about creating seasonality in your week and even in your day. The soaring state is really about day level or, 1 day level seasonality, right? That you have ups and downs in your day and that you are going to use those to your advantage so that your writing gets done in a way that makes you feel happy and not sloggy. That's work at a natural pace. Like this is what I say over and over again. The only important speed is your speed. Stop comparing yourself to other people because you really can't. So those are messages that I've been putting out on this podcast for a long time. And so I'm like really for number 1 and number 2 of Cal Newport's principles of slow productivity, which are do fewer things and work at a natural pace. I'll circle back to obsess over quality when I do my critique, when I do the things I don't like about the book. I love the idea of pseudo productivity and the way that he talks about this idea of what looks like work versus what is actually work. And he also talks a lot about like the work around the work. He calls that overhead. Like when you have a project, like every project that you have has overhead. And those are like the emails, the planning, the get together with other people and figure out how it's going to get done. Like all the work around the work, he calls overhead. I'm going to talk more about that in a second as well. But one of the things I really appreciate about this book is that he's labeling these things as pseudo productivity. Emails look like work because they are like a tangible thing, but the work actually happens when you're thinking, right? Like not on email. So I thought that this idea of pseudo productivity and that pseudo productivity as a proxy or a stand-in for real productivity was really, really important. I've actually worked with people who have said to me like, no, my university expects me to reply to student emails within 24 hours and these kinds of things. It's like, this is all ridiculous and pseudo. You want productivity. This is pseudo productivity. Responding to everybody's emails within 24 hours is pseudo productivity. So I love that idea. The other idea, this is probably my favorite idea of this whole book and the idea that I would like you to take away from this podcast, which is that the systems of how work gets done in knowledge work, the systems of how the work gets done falls on the individual doing the work. So this I love. That was like a light bulb idea for me. And I heard him talk about it first on his podcast and in different interviews. He's done like a big podcast circuit, mostly with dudes for promoting his book. Yeah, he was naming all the podcasts that he was on. I'm like, it's a dude, it's a dude, it's a dude. Like there's no, this is part of my problem or my critique of dear Cal Newport. This idea of when you work at Ford Motor Company on the production line, somebody trains you to do your work and then you do it. The system for making the car is pre-made. You walk in and participate into it. And also in agriculture as well, right? Like there's systems for getting the harvest in. There's systems for the daily milking. The milkers do this thing. They don't have to make up how milk gets taken from the cow, right? That's the systems of production are pre-established. The workers step into systems that exist. But in knowledge work, that's not true. Just think of your job as a professor. Like the major freak out that everybody, including me, has when they start their tenure track job is like, oh crap, now I have to figure out how my own systems for how to get this work done. I have to figure out how I'm going to go to these meetings and how I'm going to prep my classes and how I'm going to write and how I'm going to conduct my research and how I'm going to do grants. How you get the processes for all of that, everybody makes up from scratch. Seems like such a big waste of time to me, but that we couldn't come up with we couldn't train people to have some systems that you don't get any training. So part of the problem, the reason that our Navigate program exists, it's called Navigate This Career, is that you're not trained. You're not walking into existing systems. And I'll also add that the systems for getting knowledge work done are absolutely not one size fits all, which is another thing that I try to emphasize in my work as a writing coach, which is like, you need to figure out what works for you and start to trust yourself, try things, experiment. I'm going to give you some kind of foundation, and then you need to take it in and make it yours. And that's absolutely what we do in our Navigate program. But I never had thought about the idea that systems don't exist for knowledge workers the way they do for other kinds of work. So that was like a light bulb moment that I really appreciated from this book. And then I think I already mentioned seasonality and rhythms. I really love that he really emphasized creating seasonality. That kind of knowledge work kind of needs seasonality. I loved that. So let me give you kind of my little bit of a critique. So this is true of most of Cal Newport's work, which is that he really, maybe a little bit more, maybe not that much more than other like people who write about productivity. To me, he just really has like a white guy's perspective on things. And that doesn't mean that his perspective is not valuable, or that if you're not a white man, that you won't get value out of reading his stuff at all. Obviously, like I think the deep work is very valuable, but you have to read it with a critical lens. Like you have to look at it through a feminist lens, or you just have to take it with a little grain of salt. That has been my major kind of critique of Cal Newport's work from the start of me reading him, which was like, ooh, there's some things in here that he's suggesting that he just gives this advice with no context. And then I started like without acknowledgement that different people in different contexts can have different relationships to that advice. I mean, this is something that's hard. I mean, it's hard for me too. Like I give a lot of advice on this podcast, and in my programs, I teach methods and systems and things. But I really try hard to say, like, if you're in this position, then I understand that you have to think about this in this way. But if you're in this position, you have to think about it this way. The thing about Cal Newport is that I was like very intrigued by the slow productivity idea. I started listening to his podcast because I wanted to like see what his ideas were and be able to make this podcast for you all. So he just really scoffs literally on his podcast. He has a lot of scoffing at people who think, oh, because I'm a woman, I need to take this advice differently, or because I'm a person of color, I need to take this advice differently. Like he just scoffs at those people. And he also has a very, maybe I'm wrong. It's fine, right? This is my take. He said some things on his podcast, so not necessarily in his book as much. Like I think he's seriously getting checked in his book, and I'll tell you the evidence for that in a second. But on his podcast, he has a section in his podcast that people like write in. And this is just an example. He had somebody who is getting his PhD, and he was like, I'm getting my PhD, and there's like so many things I could focus on. What should I really focus on to be successful as a professor, right? Was the gist of the question that the person wrote in and asked. And Cal Newport's like, just focus on doing the best science or doing the best work, which is fine. That actually, I don't have so much problem with that, but then took it to the extreme, which was like, just write the best papers and you'll be fine. And that's just not true. Like we have so many freaking examples of amazing academics who wrote the best papers and got fired, or who wrote the best papers or did the best science and it was stolen. I was like, is he naive? Or is he just really blind to that because he's seeing the world from his own position? Which I kind of get, but also I'm also like, dude, check yourself. That's my frustration. And that's kind of my frustration throughout his work, is that I find that he says things in deep work that are like, oh, he like literally says things in deep work that rely on somebody else's home with my children. I can't do this advice unless somebody else is at home with my children. He does have children. He has 3 kids. And some of the advice in slow productivity that I also thought, one thing, right? He talks about overhead. And so he talks about projects have overhead. And I'm like, yes, this makes sense. Overhead is the work around the work, right? The work that needs to get done, or the work, maybe it doesn't even need to get done, but like all the emails about the work and the planning and the meetings and everything that happens, the work around the work, right? So that's overhead. And he mentions, rightfully so, that the more projects you have, the more overhead you are carrying as well. And so that starts to eat up your time that you could be doing, as he calls it, right, deep work on what you're supposed to be doing knowledge work about, whatever that is for you. So if it's your research area as a professor, or if it's your art as an artist, or your writing, if you're a writer, like the work around the work, the more projects you have, the more time you spend on overhead. So one of the things he's doing, it's saying, and do fewer things, is like, you need to have fewer projects because it's taking up less of that busy work energy if you have fewer projects, 100%. And the kinds of things that he recommends are not, like, in order to solve that problem, also have overhead with them, if depending on your identity, your positionality. He doesn't acknowledge that. So I'll give you an example. One of the things he says is like, well, when you are a knowledge worker, you have to be really aware of how new projects and new tasks get put onto your plate, right? So I think that in academia, this happens sometimes, right? The dean says, I want you to be on this committee, and you feel like you can't really say no, or that there's a lot of, it would be hard. It's hard for you to say no because it's coming from above. That happens. But then there's other ways that are more parallel in power that happens as well. Like you have a colleague who's like, oh, you want to collaborate on this. I don't know. In academia, I think we do have more agency and autonomy in what projects we take on. And in other knowledge work situations, you might not, right? Like if you're a software engineer and you're coding, your boss might be like, oh, we need you to code this thing. And you can't really say no, or it's hard to say no. So one of the ways that Cal Newport suggests in this book is, well, what he's saying is that when that happens, people are pushing work onto your plate. And what you need to do is you need to switch from a push system to a pull system. And here's his advice on how to do that. So let's imagine that your department chair says to you, hey, I want you to chair the next hiring committee. We're going to be hiring over the next year. I want you to chair the committee. And what you would say in a pull situation would be, you would say, oh, that's really interesting. I'm going to send you my project list. And all I need you to do is I need you to write the project on the top of the list. The list is in reverse order. So the project list looks like a document that's a shareable document, like a Google Doc or something. And you have all the projects that are like on hold, or the ones that are coming up that you're going to pull from. It's like a bucket of projects you pull from, are on the top half. And then there's like a line or some kind of division. And then on the bottom are the 2 or 3 projects you're working on now. And so you tell the person, oh, okay, you want me to do that? Well, here's my project list. What I need you to do is add your project to the top of the list. That means you're last in line. And when you add the project, I need you to just go ahead and link or write there any information that I need in order to do the project successfully. And then you leave it at that. And so then supposedly the department chair would go to your project list and look at it and go like, oh crap, look at all of these projects that are in line before you would get to mine. So, and it also is a pain in the butt to try to explain everything I need you to do to get that project done successfully. So they're just like less likely to put the thing on your list. And if they do put the thing on your list, you're going to see that there's all these other projects in line before yours. You also can say to the person like, oh, if you want to make an argument for one of these other projects getting bumped in favor of your project, then just let me know and we can talk about that. And usually that will like stop people from putting stuff on your list. Now, in an ideal world where everybody had equal power, where societal rules were the same for everybody, this is a fantastic idea, right? This is like, oh, that's amazing. Then everybody would really know, and you would know, what are the projects that are coming up for you and what are the things you're focusing on now? So that instead of blindly just saying yes to things or just adding or just feeling like you can't say no, and then we get these oversaturated number of projects that we're responsible for and all this overhead and everything, like all of that gets eliminated with this system. But I mean, think about what the but is, right? Like you know. But if you are junior faculty and senior faculty is telling you to do the thing, or your department chair is telling you to do the thing, you have to be really careful about how you respond. And that's overhead too. That's just one version. If you're a woman and you say no to everything, how are you appearing? Same if you're like a scholar of color and you are saying no, and you have to, that overhead into how you're going to manage telling somebody that, oh, here's my pull list, go put your project here. It's just so much more complicated than that. And it's not a problem that I don't think that it's like, I wouldn't not write it in the book. I would just like some kind of acknowledgement that this is not available to everyone in the same way, like without additional overhead, to use his terms. For our terms around it might be, it's just like that additional work that all the time scholars of color, women scholars, non-binary scholars have to do as they navigate systems that are not created for them. So I guess that's kind of my main rub, is that a lot of times Cal Newport's giving advice that feels really comes from somebody who the system was created for them. And I think what he would say to that critique is like, yeah, but that's me. How can I be somebody else? And I'm leaving that for your analysis. Like, that's it. That's all I'm going to say about that. So let me just talk one other thing. He uses a lot more examples of women in this book than he has used in any of his other books. So I think somebody has been telling him like, hey, you need to rely on women as experts too. So I thought that was good, like an improvement. But there's still like not as much acknowledgement of like the social, the political, like the context. But I appreciated hearing this like really deep story about Jewel and how she got turned down a major deal and then got, in order to get better and better, and then was able to build this beautiful, successful career. I appreciate it. But the gender-wise, there was like improvement over his other books in terms of who gets to be an authority. That's my thought there. He was just really careful. I feel like he was really careful to include more women in the book. And at the same time, he just still kept not acknowledging context. Just never not acknowledging that the consequences of enacting or applying different advice might not be the same for everyone. All right, I'm almost done. Okay, so the last part, I have to say, like I felt like this book was going real nice, very well. And then we got to the last section. And the last section was called Obsess Over Quality. And I have to say, like, this really fell flat for me. Not because I don't think you should obsess over quality. And he does acknowledge obsess over quality, that's hardly my problem. You know what I mean? Like, that a lot of people are going to be like, well, I'm probably too obsessed with quality, or in that I'm a perfectionist and I don't let projects go until I feel like they're perfect. He acknowledges that in the last section. But more, I would say, I felt like his obsess over quality examples were just not as strong as the other examples in the book. He says that obsess over quality is like the most important of the 3 principles for slow productivity, that everything else hinges on obsession over quality. And I think if that is true, then he just didn't do a great job as good a job in that section as he did in the other section in terms of his examples and making his argument. I don't feel like obsessing over quality is actually what the people in his examples did. Like the Jewel example, maybe aside. The Jewel example was good. It was like, I need to get better. Or maybe that Jewel was I can't remember if she was in the last chapter, or whether she was in the work at your own pace, work at a natural pace chapter. So I'm going to look it up and you can hear me. Let me read a couple of places that I underlined. I'm not dismissing it entirely. I'm just saying wasn't as strong as the other sections. So here's something that he specifically says on page 175 about professors. He says, when professors go up for promotion, for example, most of what occupies our days falls away from consideration. The decision comes down to exhaustive, confidential letters solicited from prominent scholars that discuss and debate the importance and impact of our research on our field. In the end, great research papers are what matter for us. So this is going back to my previous point. In the previous sentence, he said, exhaustive, confidential letters solicited from prominent scholars that discuss and debate the importance and impact of our research. That's how we get promoted. And then in the very next breath, he's like, so great research papers are what really counts, without any acknowledgement that prominent scholars, quote unquote, have certain biases. And like, this is like why this is so scary, because it has this illusion of objectivity, and it's not objective. You also could have your tenure packet, great letters, and it still gets rejected higher up because of political reasons. He goes on to say, if we haven't notably advanced our academic specialty, no amount of to-do list martyrdom can save us. I do kind of like that. I do think that there's a lot of people out there with to-do list martyrdom that probably needs to get addressed, but I don't know. Anyway, so back to obsess over quality. So what he's trying to say here, or what he is saying here, is that the pursuit, he says it on page 177, the pursuit of quality demands simplicity. Later on that page, he says, once you commit to doing something very well, busyness becomes intolerable. And again, like, I just thought his examples about this were not as good, not as strong as the other places. And also it's still like, this is the one where this thing about like context is the most prominent here for me. Yes. And also what I would say is, yes, we have to believe that we can create for ourselves careers without unnecessary busyness. We have to believe that. Like, what are we doing? If not, like, this is like, we can't, we'll explode. It's too much, right? And I believe that. That's why I built the Navigate program. That's why I have this podcast to tell you all that you get to create the career you want. You get to set the pace. You get to do it the way you want. But it's not easy. It's not easy to create that. It's not easy to create the mindset that makes that okay. It's really, I guess it's just like I just want a little acknowledgement from him about how hard that is, and how it's not equally hard for every person. It's harder for some people than others. So the other thing that rubbed me wrong about this last chapter was that he used the word taste. And I don't know, something about the word taste rubbed me wrong. That like one of the things you have to do as you obsess over quality is refine your taste. So get better at understanding what is good and what's not. And that word taste just seems so snobby to me. I don't know what. I would rather use like discernment. I think that that's a better word. But taste. Yes, I didn't like that. So that is, I guess I should probably stop talking about slow productivity now. You've listened for long enough. I appreciate you. This is a long episode. I just want to say that I am all for the pursuit of a slower, more high quality, more seasonal, less busy career. And so I really wish that for all of you. Oh, wait, but I didn't get to I do wish that for all of you. Also, and I meant to say this at the beginning of the podcast. Oh, maybe I'll go back and make a new intro to stick on the front, because this was the cliffhanger I wanted to say at the beginning that I forgot. There was a minute that I wanted to throw the book across the room. Let me tell you the minute and see if you would be with me. Here it is on page 202. The title of this section, Right After the Kids Go to Bed. And I wanted to throw this book across the room because how many times have you heard that right when the kids are sleeping? Wake up before the kids and do your writing then. And you all know, if you've been listening to this podcast for a while, that I think that is the worst advice ever. And because that means that your most important work is done outside of working hours. Think about it. The most important thing that you do, which is your writing and publishing, because that's what you're going to get promoted on, you're doing it when you should be sleeping. And that just seems like so wrong to me in terms of how we value our work and how, if we really want to change things and make things slow in the sense of slow productivity or slow foods or that kind of sense, the slow professor, I'm sorry, but your writing needs to be one of the main things that you do during your week, not a peripheral thing. I've said this many times on this podcast. Now, see, you thought this podcast was over. It's still not. In this section, I will say that he's talking about Stephenie Meyer, who's the author of Twilight, and how she wrote Twilight while she was I don't know if she was it seemed like maybe she was a stay-at-home mom. She was writing Twilight. She got the idea for it, and then she was finding all these little edges of her time to do the writing. And I think in Stephenie Meyer's case, and if this is what works for you, great. But I think it is always dangerous to tell people, because usually you're telling women, to write after the kids go to bed. I just think that's a really dangerous thing to say. It really made me want to throw the book. Now I'm done. All right. Thank you all for listening. I hope this was helpful, and I hope it helps you decide whether you want to pick up Cal Newport's new book, Slow Productivity. I love reading books. It's my favorite thing to do. So I appreciate that you listened. If you made it all the way to the end of this podcast, I really, really appreciate you. And just a little reminder that if you are looking for a slower career, in the sense of I would like to slow down to speed up. I would like to slow down to get better. I would like to feel less busy and do higher quality work, or be able to spend less harried time on the things that matter to me, then our Navigate program is the first place to me. And I'm not just saying this. I created that program 7 or 8 years ago and refined and refined and refined it through working with hundreds and hundreds of academics. And I created lots of other programs, and I have killed all my darlings except for Navigate, because I believe so strongly that this program is what every woman and non-binary academic should do in order to get that slower, focused, more enjoyable, juicy, scholarly career. It is, to me, it is the thing that you all must do. So I've actually lowered the price from where it was before. This is the time to apply for our Navigate program and do this 12-week program in our next cohort. You can go to scholarsvoice.org/navigate, find the pink button, and apply today. All right, have a great day. Bye. thank you so much for spending your valuable time supporting yourself and your writing by listening to this episode. If you like what you heard today, the best way to say thank you is to hop on over to Apple iTunes and write an honest review. The more reviews, the more amazing academic women and non-binary people will find this podcast. So go write one now.